Good evening. It's late where I am, the lamp is low, and I have a letter in front of me that I had to set down twice before I could finish it. It came from a woman named Margaret. She asked me to read it the way she wrote it, in the third person, as if she were watching it all happen to some other woman across the room. I think that's how she survived telling it. I've heard a lot of stories on this channel about money and family. But the thing that stopped me cold here wasn't the money. So pour something warm and sit with me. We begin on the worst morning of Margaret Ellsworth's life, the day they read her husband's will. For 46 years, Margaret Ellsworth had been the quiet half of a loud success. Everyone in Harlow, Ohio knew Ellsworth Gardens. The retail centers with their glass greenhouses, fogged warm in winter, the long wholesale yards stacked with mulch and foam, the delivery trucks with the little green leaf painted on the door. Walter had built it from a roadside table where at 23, he'd sold tomato seedlings out of crates. People remembered Walter. They tipped their hats to Walter. Almost no one remembered that the first real money, the money that turned a roadside table into a storefront, had come from Margaret. She had sold her mother's jewelry. The winter mitt turned Walter down, a thin gold bracelet, a pair of earrings older than the marriage. She'd never told the boys that. It hadn't seemed like the kind of thing you bragged about. It had seemed like the kind of thing you simply did when you loved someone and believed they would remember. She had stayed up the nights he balanced the books at the kitchen table, refilling his coffee. She had raised Brian and Mark almost single-handed through the years. Walter lived in the truck, driving routes that didn't exist yet. She had learned the business by osmosis, every margin, every supplier, every seasonal swing, and had never once been asked to sign her name to any of it. Walter died on a gray Tuesday in October, 18 months after the diagnosis. Pancreatic. The doctors had been honest about the timeline and wrong only by a few weeks. His body failed slowly, but his mind stayed sharp to the very end. Sharp enough, Margaret would later understand, to see things she had refused to see for years. The will was read 11 days after the funeral. It happened in the offices of Diane Mercer, the family attorney, a corner suite that smelled of new carpet and cold coffee. Margaret wore her good navy dress, the one Walter had liked. She sat in a leather chair that was slightly too deep for her, so that her feet didn't quite rest flat, and she folded her hands in her lap like a woman waiting to be told she could go. She wasn't worried. That was the part she would replay for months afterward. How unworried she had been. 46 years. Of course she would be cared for. The boys would inherit the business. That was right. That was natural. She only needed enough to keep the house and live with a little dignity. She had assumed dignity was the one thing no one would think to take. Brian sat to her left, broad and impatient, checking his phone. Beside him, his wife, Stephanie, sat with the still, bright attention of someone watching a horse she'd bet on. Mark sat to the right, thinner than Margaret liked, his knee bouncing under the table, his eyes a little glassy, in a way she told herself was grief. Diane Mercer began to read in the flat, professional voice lawyers used to make enormous things sound like paperwork. To my son Brian, she read, I leave the wholesale and landscape supply division of Ellsworth Gardens, together with the associated equipment, contracts, and the Route 9 distribution yard. Brian exhaled through his nose, satisfied the way a man does when something he's already counted lands in his hand. To my son Mark, I leave the 4 retail garden centers, including inventory, fixtures, and goodwill. Mark nodded too quickly. His knee kept bouncing. The figures came next, and they were not small. The visible estate, the divisions, the commercial parcels they sat on, the trucks, the brand, came to roughly $28 million, split between the 2 sons. Margaret listened to her husband's life sorted into clauses and felt the strange vertigo of hearing decades described as assets. She kept waiting politely for her own name. When it came, Diane Mercer paused. She shuffled a page. She did not quite look up. To my wife, Margaret Ellsworth, she read, I leave the lakeside cabin at Birch Point, together with its contents, a beat, and my personal effects as itemized. That was all. Margaret waited for more. There was no more Birch Point. She knew that cabin. It was the original one. A single-room thing on the far side of Cutter's Lake that Walter had bought before the business, before the boys, when they were young and broke and happy. They hadn't used it in 15 years. The last she'd seen it, the porch was rotting and a tree had come down across the back roof. It wasn't worth the cost of tearing it down. Diane Mercer slid 2 items across the polished table toward her. The first was a leather satchel, Walter's old one, the brown one he'd carried to every supplier meeting for 30 years, the strap dark and cracked where his hand had worn it. The second was a key, a small brass key, the kind that fits a lockbox or an old cabinet, its tip slightly bent, as if it had been dropped and stepped on at some point in its long, dull life. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Stephanie laughed. It was a small laugh, bright and sharp, covered almost, but not quite, by her hand. "Oh," she said, with a sweetness that landed like a slap. "Well, at least you'll have somewhere quiet to keep your seed packets, Margaret." Brian smirked and looked back down at his phone. Mark didn't laugh, but he didn't speak either. He looked at the table, at his own bouncing knee, at anything but his mother. Margaret picked up the satchel. It was nearly empty. It weighed almost nothing in her hands. She picked up the key. It was cold and absurdly light, and it meant nothing to her at all. She understood, in that moment, exactly what had happened, the way you understand a stair that isn't there. 46 years had been weighed and measured and found to be worth a falling down cabin and a dead man's empty bag. Diane Mercer was already turning to the sons, talking briskly about deeds and transfers, and the timeline for taking control of their divisions, about a meeting next week, about signatures. She spoke as though Margaret had quietly left the room, as though the chair she sat in were empty, as though she were a coat someone had forgotten on the back of a door. Margaret started to speak. She wasn't even sure what she meant to say, only that some small, stubborn thing in her wanted, for once, to be heard. Walter would never have. Under the table, where no one could see, Brian's hand closed around her forearm. It wasn't gentle. His fingers pressed into the thin skin over the bone, hard enough that she felt the bruise begin before he'd even finished. And he leaned toward her with that easy public smile still on his face and said very quietly, so only she could hear, "Don't make this difficult, Mom. Nobody wants a scene." Then, louder for the room, warm as a brochure, "We just want what's best for you. We've actually been talking about that, about getting you somewhere you don't have to worry about a thing, somewhere they look after you. Cedar Hollow's supposed to be lovely." He said it the way you'd suggest a restaurant, for your own good. The phrase hung in the air. Stephanie nodded along. Mark stared at the table. Diane Mercer kept writing, and Margaret felt the cold print of her son's fingers fading on her arm, while the bruise underneath went on quietly blooming. She did not make a scene. She set the satchel strap over her shoulder. She closed her fingers around the bent brass key. She stood slowly, because the chair was too deep and no one rose to help her, and she walked to the door alone. No one said goodbye. No one offered her a ride. The receptionist was on the phone and did not look up. Outside, the October air had the metal smell of coming rain. Margaret stood on the sidewalk of the town where she had spent her entire adult life, where she had sold her mother's jewelry, raised 2 sons, refilled 10,000 cups of coffee for a man who built an empire, and she felt the whole of it reduced to the small cold weight in her coat pocket. She did not cry there on the street. She would later in the empty house the way she hadn't cried since she was a girl. But not yet. For now she only walked, with a dead man's empty bag on her shoulder and a broken key in her pocket, the one thing in all the world that was finally and entirely hers. She had no idea yet what it opened. She had walked out of that office with a broken brass key in her coat pocket, and for 3 days she did almost nothing else but carry it. The drive home was 4 miles she did not remember making. She found herself in her own driveway with the engine off and her hands still on the wheel, the October light going thin and silver over the rooftops of a neighborhood she had lived in for 30 years. The bruise on her forearm had come up by then, 4 small ovals and a larger one, the shape of a hand that had wanted her quiet. She pushed her sleeve down over it before she went inside, as though there were anyone left in the house to hide it from. There wasn't. That was the thing about the house now. It had always been quiet, Walter had been gone all day for 40 years, the boys grown and gone for 15, but it had been a quiet with someone coming home at the end of it. Now it was a different quiet entirely. She stood in the front hall and listened to it. The refrigerator hummed. The clock in the kitchen ticked. Somewhere a pipe knocked once and went still, and none of it was Walter, and none of it ever would be again. She set the satchel on the bench by the door. She did not open it. That first night she cried the way she had not cried since she was 9 years old and had understood, standing at a different graveside, that her own mother was not coming back. It was not a soft, dignified weeping. It came up out of her in a way that frightened her, doubled her over the kitchen sink, left her gripping the cold porcelain edge with both hands. She cried for Walter, and this shamed her, she cried for herself, for the chair that had been too deep, for the laugh behind a manicured hand, for the word mom spoken low while fingers pressed into bone. She cried until she was empty and her face was raw, and then she ran the tap and washed it and went to bed and lay flat on her back on her side of a bed that was now simply the bed, and stared at the ceiling until the dark went gray. For 3 days she did not open the satchel. She told herself she was grieving, and that was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she was afraid. She had been handed empty things before, empty promises, empty rooms, an empty chair at her own husband's will, and she did not think she could survive opening that bag and finding inside it only what it looked like it held. A dead man's pens, a dead man's reading glasses, a folded handkerchief, nothing. One more emptiness, this one in Walter's own hand. She would rather not know than know that. On the fourth day, the phone rang, and that was what finally made her open it. It was Brian. He used the voice. She had a name for it now privately. The voice, the warm, managing, slightly too slow voice he used when he wanted something and had decided in advance that she would be difficult about it. Hey, Mom, just checking in. How are you holding up out there all by yourself in that big house? I'm fine, Brian. You sound tired. You're not sleeping, I bet. That house is too much for one person. You know that, right? All those stairs. A pause, the kind that's been planned. Steph and I were saying, we should really get you somewhere. You don't have to think about any of it. There's no shame in it. People your age, they actually do better with a little structure, a little company, Siddhar Hollow. He didn't say it this time. He didn't have to. She could hear the brochure in his voice. The gardens and the activity rooms, the place 3 counties over where families set inconvenient mothers down and slowly forgot the way back. I'll think about it, she said, because she had learned in 46 years exactly how much you could buy with those 4 words. That's all I'm asking. We just want what's best. And there it was again. For your own good. She heard faintly Stephanie's voice in the background and Brian's hand going over the phone. And then he was back, brisk now, the warmth switched off like a lamp. Okay, love you. We'll come by this week, talk it through properly. He hung up before she could answer. She stood in the hall with the dead phone in her hand and looked at the satchel on the bench, and something in her, the same small, stubborn thing that had tried to speak in that office and been pressed quiet, got up off the floor. This week, he'd said, talk it through properly. She knew what that meant now, or she was beginning to. They were not asking, they were scheduling. She sat down on the bench beside the bag, and she opened it. The smell came first, leather and old paper, and very faintly, the cedar shavings Walter had always kept in his desk drawer to keep the damp out. It undid her a little, that smell, the way a smell. She had to sit with it a moment before she could go on. Inside on top were the things the will had promised. His good fountain pen, the reading glasses with the scratch on the left lens he'd refused to replace, a handkerchief, ironed monogram WE, a small framed photograph she hadn't seen in years, the 2 of them at the roadside table, impossibly young, Walter's arm around her, a wooden crate of tomato seedlings between them and the whole rest of their lives still ahead and unspent. And underneath all of it, flat against the bottom of the bag, a single folded sheet of paper with her name on it in his handwriting. She knew his hand the way she knew his voice, that sloping, deliberate script she had seen on 40 years of birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left propped against the coffee pot before dawn. Gone to the Route 9 yard, back by 6, Don't wait dinner. Her hands shook as she unfolded it, and for a moment she had to wait for the letters to hold still. It was short. That was almost the worst of it, how short it was and how much it held. Maggie, if you've got this, then I'm gone and the will's been read, and I know exactly how that went because I'm the one who wrote it that way. I need you to trust me one more time. I know that's a lot to ask after everything, after the bag and the cabin, and whatever face that lawyer made when she read it. I'm sorry, I had reasons, you'll see them. The key fits a box. Not at home at the bank, the one on Mercer Street, the safe deposit room downstairs. Take the key. Take this letter. Take your ID and go alone. And before you do anything else, before you let any of them tell you a single thing about what's yours and what isn't, go and see a man named Edward Cole. His card is in the side pocket. He's been waiting for you. He knows more than I had the strength to write down. The boys can't know about any of this. Not yet. Not until you do. What you'll find is only the beginning, Maggie. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you to your face. I was a coward about exactly one thing in my whole life, and this was it. Forgive me. She read it 4 times. I know exactly how that went because I'm the one who wrote it that way. He had meant it. The empty bag, the laughing daughter-in-law, the cabin no one wanted. Walter had built all of it on purpose, had reached out from the far side of death and arranged her humiliation with his own hand. And the not knowing why of it was a physical thing in her chest, a pressure under the breastbone that made it hard to draw a full breath. The boys can't know. Know what? What was there to know about 2 sons who ran 2 halves of a garden business, called their mother the voice, and talked, gently, about somewhere she wouldn't have to worry about a thing? She reached into the side pocket of the satchel, and her fingers found a card. Heavy stock, plain, a little soft at one corner from sitting there in the dark for who knew how long. Edward Cole, attorney at law. Estates and fiduciary matters, an address 2 towns over. A number written by hand on the back in Walter's writing this time, underlined twice. She sat on the bench in the dark front hall for a long time after that, the card in one hand and the letter in the other, and she did not cry. She had cried herself out 3 nights ago. What she felt now was different, something colder and clearer, like the first hard air of the season coming through a door left open. Her husband had kept a secret from her. After 46 years, her husband had kept a man from her, a whole arrangement, a whole hidden architecture, and had been a coward about exactly one thing in his life, and the thing was her. She should have been angry. Some part of her was. But underneath the anger was something she would only be able to name much later, sitting in a greenhouse at dawn. She was curious. For the first time since the gray Tuesday in October, for the first time in years, if she was honest, she wanted to know what happened next. She did not sleep that night either, but it was a different sleeplessness, not the flat, ceiling-staring kind. She lay awake turning the same questions over and over, the way you turn a stone looking for the dry side. What did he find? Why a stranger and not me? Why the bag? Why the laughing? Why let them treat me like a coat on a door? And under all of it, quietly, the question that frightened her most, because she already half knew the shape of the answer and did not want to see it whole. What is it about my own sons that my husband thought I needed a lawyer to survive? In the morning, gray and cold, she drove out to the cabin. She didn't fully know why. The bank could wait an hour. Edward Cole could wait one more day. But she wanted, before any of it, to stand in the one place Walter had actually left to her, to see with her own eyes whether even that was a joke. Birch Point was worse than she remembered, and somehow better. The porch sagged. The tree was still down across the back roof, gone soft and gray. The single window was filmed with 15 years of pollen and rain, but the lake was the lake. Cutter's Lake, flat and pewter under the low sky, ringed with birches gone bare and gold exactly as it had been the autumn they bought the place. 24 years old, no money, no sons, no empire, just the 2 of them standing on this exact rotting porch that had not yet rotted. Walter saying, "One day, Maggie, one day," and meaning the whole world. She stood there a long while in the cold. She thought about the young man in the photograph at the bottom of the bag, his arm around a girl who had sold her mother's bracelet that same winter and never said a word about it. She thought, he didn't leave me the worthless thing. He left me the first thing. He left me where it started. And standing on the broken porch of a cabin no one else had wanted, looking out at the gray water, Margaret Ellsworth made a small decision that did not feel small at all. She was going to find out, all of it. Whatever Walter had been too much of a coward to say, whatever the boys could not be allowed to know, whatever was at the bottom of that locked box on Mercer Street. She was going to walk straight into it with her eyes open, and she was not going to be talked, gently, into a quiet room first. She drove back to town. She got Edward Cole's card off the kitchen counter, and she sat at the table where she had refilled 10,000 cups of coffee, and she dialed the handwritten number before she could lose her nerve. She almost lost it anyway. A woman answered, "Cole and Associates. How may I help you?" And Margaret's mouth went dry, and for one long, ridiculous second, she nearly hung up, nearly set the phone down, and went back to the safe, sane misery of not knowing, of I'll think about it, of being a coat on a door. It would have been so much easier. There is a terrible comfort in being underestimated. You are never asked to do anything hard. "My name is Margaret Ellsworth," she heard herself say. The name came out steadier than she felt. "My late husband was Walter Ellsworth. I believe Mr. Cole has been expecting me." There was a small silence on the line. Then the woman's voice changed, warmed, dropped, went careful in a way that told Margaret, even before any appointment was made, that this was real, that there was something, that whatever waited at the bottom of all this was not another empty bag. "Mrs. Ellsworth," the woman said gently. "Yes, Mr. Cole has been hoping you'd call. He cleared time for you weeks ago. Can you come tomorrow morning?" She could. She did. And so the next morning found Margaret Ellsworth sitting in her car outside a low brick office 2 towns over, 15 minutes early because she had not been able to make herself wait at home, with Walter's old satchel held in both arms against her chest, the way you hold a railing on a staircase when you cannot yet see the bottom, and inside it a bent brass key, a coward's letter, and the first true beginning of the rest of her life. She watched the door. She gathered what was left of her nerve. And at 9 o'clock exactly, she got out of the car and went in to learn what her husband had died trying to tell her. She went in at 9 o'clock exactly, with the satchel held against her chest, and a man rose from behind a desk to meet her, as though he had been waiting a long time to do exactly that. Edward Cole was older than she'd expected, 70, perhaps, with a long, lined, unhurried face and white hair combed straight back, and eyes that were kind in the particular way people who have spent a career delivering hard news gently. He did not give her the bright, brisk handshake of Diane Mercer's office. He took her hand in both of his, and he held it a moment, and he said, "Mrs. Ellsworth, I'm so very sorry about Walter. He was a good man, and he was my friend, and I have been hoping you would walk through that door since the morning we buried him." Something in the plainness of it nearly undid her. She had braced for another cold room. She sat down across from him, and he poured her water she didn't ask for and set it within reach, and he waited until she had her breath before he began. "He told me you'd be frightened," Edward said. "He told me you'd very likely have talked yourself out of coming at least twice on the way here." A small, sad smile. "3 times," Margaret said, and the man laughed softly, and just like that, the worst of the fear went out of the room. "All right." He folded his hands on the desk. There was a file in front of him, thick, the kind of file that has been built slowly over a long time. "Then let me tell you what your husband spent the last 18 months of his life doing, Mrs. Ellsworth. Because I promise you it was not dying. He did that on the side. What he was really doing was protecting you. And I'm afraid that to understand how he protected you, you're first going to have to hear what he was protecting you from. It isn't easy. Take the water." She took the water. First, the part that's good news, though it won't feel like it yet, because it's going to make you angry. Edward opened the file. The will that was read in Diane Mercer's office is real. It's valid. It does exactly what it appears to do. It gives Brian the wholesale division and Mark the 4 retail centers, and on paper that's roughly $28 million passing to your sons. He looked at her steadily. "But that will, Mrs. Ellsworth, is the smaller half of your husband's estate. It's the half he wanted read aloud. It's the half he wanted them watching. I don't understand. No, you will. He drew out a single document, several pages, bound. 18 months ago, when Walter got his diagnosis, he came to me, not to Diane, to me, and he created something called a living trust. A revocable trust then made irrevocable on his death. Do you know what that is? I've heard the words. It's a legal container. Think of it as a vault that owns things and answers to one person. Over the last year and a half, quietly, a piece at a time, Walter moved the real foundation of everything into that vault. Not the trucks and the inventory and the brand, those he left to the boys like bait. He moved the land, Mrs. Ellsworth. The actual real estate under all 4 retail centers and under the Route 9 yard. He moved the controlling block of voting shares in the parent company that sits over both divisions. He moved his investment portfolio, and he moved the proceeds of a life insurance policy your sons don't know exists. Edward turned the document so it faced her and laid one finger beside a name. The name was hers, Margaret Ann Ellsworth, sole beneficiary and trustee. All of it is yours, he said quietly, free of the will entirely. It never went through the reading because legally it never had to. A properly funded trust skips probate, skips the public process, skips the lawyer who reads things aloud in a corner office. Your sons inherited the business, Mrs. Ellsworth, but you own the ground it stands on and you hold the votes that control it. They are, as of 2 weeks ago, your tenants. They simply don't know it. The room was very quiet. The clock on Edward's wall ticked. Margaret looked at her own name on the page and felt the floor of her certainty shift. How much, she heard herself ask, and was ashamed of asking, and asked anyway, is all of it? The land, the shares, the portfolio, the insurance. Edward did not hesitate, did not soften it into vagueness. Conservatively today, around $45 million. More, frankly, once the spring season turns. The business is worth far more with the land under it than either half is worth alone, which Walter knew, and which is precisely why he separated them. 45 million. She set the glass of water down before her hand could betray her with it, but that she would understand this about herself later, and it would matter. That was not the part that broke her. The number was just a number. It was too large to feel. She would have traded all of it, every dollar, to have the gray Tuesday in October back, to have Walter at the kitchen table one more night with his bad reading glasses and his good fountain pen. Money had never been the thing she wanted from this family. Dignity was the thing, and she was about to learn precisely what that had nearly cost her. You said, she began slowly, that I have to understand what he was protecting me from. The kindness in Edward's face did not change. Something behind it set, the way a face sets before it has to do something difficult. Yes, he said, I do. And I'm going to let him tell you himself, because he wrote it for exactly this moment, and he was a better man with the words than I'll ever be. He took an envelope from the file, thick, sealed, her name on the front in the sloping hand she would have known anywhere, and he placed it in front of her, and then he stood. I'll be just outside. Take as long as you need. There's no hurry in the world that's bigger than this letter. And he went out and closed the door softly and left her alone with her husband's voice. She broke the seal. Maggie, by now Ed's told you about the trust. So you know I didn't leave you a bag in a falling down cabin because I stopped loving you. I left you those things because I needed the boys to believe I had. I needed them to show you, with the lawyer watching and the papers signed, exactly who they've become, before you knew you had any power at all. I needed you to see their real faces while they still thought you were powerless. I'm sorry. It was the cruelest kind thing I've ever done. I did it on purpose. I'd do it again, and here's why. Maggie, our sons are not the men we raised. I found it out slow over the last 2 years, the way you find rot in a beam, a little give underfoot. Then you put your weight down and the whole floor goes. Brian's been stealing from the company. 3 years of it. Phantom invoices, suppliers that don't exist, money out the side door. I hired a forensic accountant. That's most of what's in Ed's file. And the number, best we can tell, is about $1.5 million. It's gambling, Maggie. Been gambling for years. He's mortgaged that house of his twice, and Stephanie doesn't know, or pretends she doesn't. He's into people who don't take late payments kindly. And Mark, here the handwriting changed. It got smaller and harder to read. And she understood that this was the part Walter had not been able to write quickly. Our Mark is sick, Maggie. He has an addiction. Pills, then worse than pills. It started after his back surgery. You remember, 4 years ago, we thought he just got quiet, and it never stopped. It only got better at hiding. He's been forging checks against the retail accounts to feed it. He owes money to a man who lends to desperate people at the kind of interest that's designed never to be paid off. That's why his hands shake. That's why he wouldn't look at you. It isn't grief, Maggie. I wish to God it were grief. I love them both. I want you to hear me say that because of what comes next. I love them and I have grieved them like the dead because in a way I've already lost them and there was nothing. Believe me, I tried everything a dying man has time to try. Nothing I could do to reach them in the time I had left. But here is the thing I cannot forgive. Here is the reason for everything I've done. About 4 months ago, I was upstairs, supposed to be asleep. The medication knocks me flat by 8 most nights now, and they were in my own study, the three of them, Brian and Stephanie and Mark. They didn't know I'd come down for water and stopped on the stairs. And I stood in the dark of my own house, Maggie, and I listened to my children plan what to do with you once I was gone. They're going to have you declared incompetent. That's the plan. The minute I'm in the ground, before you've stopped wearing black, while you're soft with grief and easy to push, they're going to file for guardianship. Stephanie's word was conservatorship. A doctor signs a paper, a judge signs a paper, and then a grown woman who built half of everything I have is somebody's ward, with no money of her own, no signature that counts, no say. They had the place picked out. Cedar Hollow. I heard Brian say it, and I heard Stephanie say something I am going to put down word for word, so you'll know I'm not exaggerating. She said, once she's settled in there, who's she going to complain to? She's just a sad old woman who lost her husband. Nobody listens to those. Nobody listens to those. I have listened to you for 46 years, Maggie. I have not always done it well. I have let you stand in my shadow when you should have stood in the sun, and that's my sin, and I'll answer for it. But I will not let them lock you in a quiet room and steal the rest of your life while you wait, patient and polite, for a kindness that was never coming. So I built you a different ending. The trust is the armor. Ed has the file, every invoice, every forged check, every recording, every dollar, and the file is the sword. I've given you both. What you do with them is yours to decide, and only yours. And whatever you choose, I'll be proud of you, because for once in your life, the choosing is yours. But choose with your eyes open, my love. They are not going to come at you like enemies. They're going to come at you like sons. They're going to come with brochures and worried faces and the word love in their mouths, and they have already chosen the room they mean to put you in. Don't go quiet. Walter, she did not cry. That was the strangest thing, the thing she would try to explain to Edward Cole when he came back in and found her sitting perfectly still with the pages flat in front of her and her face dry. She had thought she would cry. There was so much in the letter to cry about. The rot in her sons, the sickness in her youngest, the dying man on the dark stairs listening to his children sell off his wife. Any one of those should have broken her. But what she felt was not grief, and it was not even yet rage. It was a terrible, clarifying cold, spreading out from the center of her chest, and inside the cold, one fact stood up and would not sit back down. They had already chosen the room. Not the betrayal in the abstract, not the money, the room. While she had sat in that too-deep leather chair, waiting politely for her own name, while she had driven home, not remembering the road, while she had cried herself empty over the kitchen sink and pulled her sleeve down over the bruise so no one would see. Her children had already toured the facility, picked the hall, discussed in her husband's own study how easy she would be to push, because grief makes a woman soft, and who would a sad old widow even complain to, and nobody listens to those. The arm of her chair was solid wood. She found that she was gripping it hard, the way she had gripped the porcelain sink. She made herself let go, one finger at a time. When Edward Cole came back in, he read her face, and whatever he had been about to say, he didn't. He sat down across from her quietly and waited. He recorded them, she said at last. Her voice came out level, which surprised them both. Walter, on the stairs, he said, you have it. I have it. Edward's hands were folded. I have all of it, Mrs. Ellsworth. The audit, the forensic accounting on Brian, the bank records, the lender. And yes, a recording your husband made the night on the stairs, and 3 others after it, because once he knew what to listen for, he kept listening. He paused. There's one more thing in the file you need to see today, and only one, and then I'll let you go home and sit with all of it as long as you need. Show me. He drew out a slim folder and opened it and turned it toward her, and she looked down at a document on heavy legal papers, several pages official, with a court caption at the top and blank lines at the bottom waiting for signatures. Petition for appointment of emergency guardian and conservator in the matter of Margaret A. Ellsworth, an alleged incapacitated person. Walter's investigator obtained a draft, Edward said gently. It is not finished. But it is real and it is waiting, and look here. His finger moved down the page at who prepared it. The attorney of record, typed neatly in the box at the bottom, was Diane Mercer. The same lawyer, Margaret said slowly, who read me husband's will, who slid me the empty bag across the table and watched my daughter-in-law laugh. The same, which I'll note for when the time comes, is a conflict of interest serious enough to end a legal career. Edward let her sit with it. There's a physician already lined up to perform the capacity evaluation, a doctor, Pierce, who has done this kind of favor before, for money and not carefully. The petition can be filed the moment they decide you're ready. Likely the next time they get you alone, which I'd imagine is the visit your son mentioned, this week, to talk it through properly. The clock ticked. Outside the window, an ordinary gray Ohio morning went on. People parking cars, a delivery van idling, the whole indifferent world. Edward closed the folder. So here is where I'm obligated to tell you that you have a choice, Mrs. Ellsworth, and that it is entirely yours, and that Walter was insistent I not lean on it. He folded his hands again. You have the trust. $45 million and the controlling vote, free and clear, sitting in a vault with your name on it. You could simply take it, move quietly, secure your money, hire security, refuse their visits, let your lawyers wall you off, and never see those people again. You'd be safe. It's a real option and not a coward's one. Many people in your position would take it and sleep fine. He looked at her. Or, he said, you can use the sword as well as the armor. You can let them come, let them walk in with their doctor and their petition and their worried faces, and you can be ready. But I won't pretend that road is safe, and I won't pretend it's clean, and I won't choose it for you. So I'll ask you plainly, and then I'll do exactly what you say, and not one thing more. He leaned forward slightly. What do you want to do, Margaret? She thought of the porch at Birch Point, 24 years old. One day, Maggie, one day. She thought of her mother's bracelet, gone that long ago winter and never once mentioned. She thought of 46 years of refilled coffee and unsigned ledgers and standing, patient and polite, just outside the light. She thought of a chair too deep for her feet to reach the floor, and a hand closing on her arm under a table, and her son's voice, low and warm and certain. Nobody wants a scene. And she thought, they have already chosen the room. Margaret Ellsworth sat up straight. When she spoke, her voice did not shake at all, and it was not, Edward Cole would say afterward, the voice of a sad old woman who had lost her husband. It was the voice of someone who had finally, after a very long time, decided to stop waiting to be heard. Tell me exactly how much time I have, she said, and then tell me how we get ready. Edward Cole had given her the time in plain numbers, days, not weeks, and then he had given her the rest of that morning, and it had not felt like a lawyer's meeting at all. It had felt like a war council run by two people who loved the same dead man. The instructions, when they came, were quieter and stranger than she'd imagined. She had pictured something dramatic. Bodyguards, locked doors, a fortress. Edward wanted almost the opposite. Let them come, he said. Don't change a thing they can see. Don't lawyer up where they'll notice. Don't move your money where the bank will flag it to them. If they suspect, even for a second, that you know, they'll either run, and we lose the chance to stop them cleanly, or they'll move faster and rougher. So we hide the armor under the same old cardigan, Margaret. We let them keep believing you're exactly the woman they buried their father, expecting you to be. It went against every nerve in her body. For 3 days, she lived inside the hardest performance of her life. The soft, grieving, slightly confused widow, exactly as advertised. When Brian called, and he called twice more that week, the voice getting warmer and more managing each time, she let herself sound tired and small. I'll think about it. I'm just so tired, Brian. I can't make decisions like this right now. Each time she hung up, she had to sit and breathe before her hands would steady, because every word of it was bait, and she was the one laying it, and she had never in her life set a trap for her own children before. Edward had given her exactly one piece of equipment, and it sat in the pocket of her cardigan like a stone. A small voice recorder, the kind a court would accept, with a single button worn smooth where his thumb had tested it. Ohio's a one-party consent state, he'd told her. You're allowed to record any conversation you're a part of. You don't need their permission. You don't need to tell them. The day they come, and they will come, you press this before you open the door, and you let them say it all. She practiced pressing it without looking down. By the third day, she could do it with one hand in her pocket, while pouring coffee with the other. They came on Friday morning. She had known it would be Friday in the way you know weather. Brian's last call had ended with, "We'll swing by. Get this sorted before the weekend." No pressure. And no pressure from Brian had always meant the opposite. So when the cars pulled into her drive at 10 o'clock, two of them, which her stomach noted before her mind did, two cars, who's in the second car? Margaret was already standing in the kitchen in her oldest cardigan with her thumb resting against a smooth, worn button in her pocket. She pressed it. She heard nothing. That was the point. Then she went to answer her own front door and let her face go soft and uncertain and opened it. Brian first, big in the doorway, in a good coat, with the voice already running. "Hey, Mom, there she is. You doing okay? You sleeping?" A kiss on the cheek that did not reach her. Behind him, Stephanie, immaculate, carrying a folder and a bright, cool smile, saying, "Margaret, you poor thing, this house, all alone before she was even through the door." And behind them, from the second car, a man Margaret had never seen. 50s, soft-handed, a gray suit a little shiny at the knees, a black leather bag of the kind doctors carried. He had the careful, professionally warm expression of a man who had learned to look kind because it was useful. "Mom," Brian said, "all ease. This is Dr. Pierce. Don't make a thing of it. He's just a friend. He was in the area. And Steph and I figured, while we're all here, no harm having someone take a quick look at you. Make sure you're holding up. You've been through so much." There he is, she thought, with the cold clarity that had not left her since Edward's office. There's the doctor. They brought the doctor. In her pocket, the recorder turned, and she let none of it show on her face except a tired, grateful confusion. "That's kind of you," she said. "I suppose." Would everyone like coffee? They settled in her living room, the room where she and Walter had watched 40 years of television, where the good chair was his chair. And she noticed that Brian sat in it without a thought, and she let herself notice and said nothing. Stephanie set the folder on the coffee table, face down, with the casual deliberateness of a card player. Dr. Pierce took the wingback near the window and opened his black bag and set out on her coffee table a small stack of forms and a pen and a folder of his own. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said, in a syrupy, slowed-down voice she recognized instantly, the voice people used on her now, the voice you'd use on a child or a dog. "I just want to ask you a few simple questions. Nothing to worry about. Routine for a woman who's recently lost her spouse. We just want to make sure you're coping. Is that all right?" "Of course," Margaret said softly. She knew this catechism. Walter's letter had told her, and Edward had walked her through it twice, but she would have known it anyway, because some animal part of her had understood the shape of it the moment the second car door opened. These were not a doctor's questions. They were a trap's questions. The standard battery used to establish disorientation, the little ladder of inquiries you could climb down a person's competence on, rung by rung, until you reached a signature at the bottom. "Can you tell me what day it is today?" Dr. Pierce asked. "Pen ready. Friday," Margaret said, and then deliberately, before she could decide not to, "October 27th, the smallest pause." He wrote something. "And do you know where you are right now?" "My living room," she said. "In the house my husband and I bought in 1993. 11 Sycamore Lane. Another small pause. Brian shifted in Walter's chair. Stephanie's bright smile held, but her eyes flicked once to the doctor. Very good, Dr. Pierce said, the warmth a half-degree cooler. Now, can you tell me how much money you inherited under your husband's will? And there it was, the real question. The hook under the bait. She understood it perfectly. Edward had named it exactly. If you say you got nothing but a bag and a cabin, you confirm you've been left with no resources, which makes a guardianship for your protection easy to justify. If you start talking about $45 million in a secret trust, you sound delusional, grandiose, paranoid, a textbook line on the evaluation, and that's even better for them. Either answer was a trap door. There was only the narrow board between. Margaret looked at her hands. She let the silence stretch until it was almost too long, until she saw Stephanie lean infinitesimally forward. I inherited the cabin at Birch Point, she said quietly, and Walter's personal things. The business went to the boys, $28 million it was read as. To Brian and Mark, she lifted her eyes and made them watery and made her chin tremble just slightly. I got the bag, doctor. I got a little brass key that doesn't open anything I've found. That's what 46 years came to. It was, she would think later, the finest piece of acting of her entire life and the most painful, because almost every word of it was true. Dr. Pierce wrote at some length. She watched his pen. She knew the words it was forming. Patient presence with grief, financial disorientation, possible depressive symptoms, the gentle, clinical, ruinous vocabulary that would become, 3 pages later, recommend appointment of guardian. Brian was watching her with an expression of such warm, false concern that she had to look away from it or lose her composure entirely. Stephanie's hand rested lightly on the face-down folder. And how do you feel, Dr. Pierce asked in the voice, about how things were divided? It must be very hard, very frightening being on your own at your age with so little after so long. This was the closer. Get her to express resentment, confusion, helplessness, and we have feeling to put underneath the findings. And here is the part Margaret never told anyone, except much later, a quiet room full of women who understood it without being told. For one moment, one long, terrible moment, sitting in her own living room with her dead husband's chair occupied by a son's son who'd bruised her arm, with a paid doctor's pen poised over a form, with the gray autumn light coming flat through the window. For one moment, she wanted to take the pen, not the doctor's pen, the other one, the one she could feel waiting just out of sight under Stephanie's face-down folder. She knew what was in that folder. She'd seen its draft on heavy legal paper in Edward Cole's office. Petition for appointment of emergency guardian, and she was so tired. She was 68 years old and not even a month a widow, and her children had come into her home with a doctor, and there was a part of her, older than her rage, older than her dignity, the part that had refilled 10,000 cups of coffee and sold her mother's bracelet without a word, that simply wanted it to stop, that whispered, let them have it. Sign the paper, go to the quiet room, set the whole heavy thing down. You're so tired, Maggie. Wouldn't it be a relief to finally not be the one who has to fight? It would have been so easy. That was the thing Edward could never have warned her about, because he hadn't lived it. The trap wasn't only their cruelty. The trap was her own exhaustion, dressed up as peace. Her eyes drifted in that moment to the bookshelf by the window, where she had set Walter's old leather satchel. She hadn't been able to put it away, hadn't been able to make herself move it from where she could see it. The strap dark and cracked where his hand had worn it for 30 years. Don't go quiet, the letter had said. Don't go quiet, my love. The whisper let go of her. How do I feel? Margaret repeated, and her voice came out clear and steady and entirely her own. And she watched Doctor Pierce's pen stop moving, and she watched Brian go still in his father's chair. She lifted her head and looked, not at the doctor, but at her son. I feel, she said, like a woman who is finally seeing her family clearly for the first time in years. The room changed temperature. Stephanie's smile slipped a single notch. That's an interesting way to put it, Dr. Pierce said carefully, recovering, pen lifting again. Can you say more about Dr. Margaret said, what hospital are you affiliated with? He blinked. I beg your pardon. Your hospital. Your practice. Where do you see patience? She kept her voice mild, pleasant, terribly clear. Because Brian said you were a friend who happened to be in the area, but you brought a black bag and a folder of forms and a competency to battery you've clearly given many times. And you've been writing without pause for 10 minutes. I'm a grieving widow, doctor. I'm not a senile one. And I'd very much like to know the name of the hospital. The silence was total. Mom, Brian started, the warmth gone now, a warning edge under it. What are you? And while we're asking simple questions, Margaret went on, turning to Stephanie, nodding at the folder beneath her manicured hand. What's in the folder, dear? The one you've kept face down since you walked in. Shall I tell you what I think is in it? She did not raise her voice. She had never, in 46 years, raised her voice in this house, and she did not need to start now. I think it's a petition for a guardianship, with my name on it as the alleged incapacitated person. I think it's already drafted. I think you brought a doctor to my house this morning to write down that I'm confused, and a petition to file the moment he did, and I think the plan was to have it all sorted, as Brian likes to say, before the weekend. Stephanie's hand came off the folder as though it had gone hot. Dr. Pierce was already capping his pen, already reaching for his bag. The warmth entirely fled from his soft face, replaced by the specific gray look of a man who has realized the room is not the room he thought he walked into. I think there's clearly been some misunderstanding, Mrs. Ellsworth. I should really be. Sit down, Dr. Margaret said. He sat down. She would wonder about that, afterward, that he obeyed her. A 68-year-old woman in an old cardigan. She thought it was because, for the first time, he heard in her voice that she was not the soft thing the file described, and a careful man, when the ground shifts, holds still. How much? She asked him. Did they pay you to come here this morning and write that down? I don't. This is a routine, Brian. She turned to her son. He had risen halfway out of Walter's chair, his face dark, the easy public mask gone, and underneath it the cold, calculating thing she had seen flash once in a lawyer's office when fingers closed around her arm. Sit down in your father's chair, since you've made yourself so comfortable in it, and tell me, was it Cedar Hollow? Is that still the plan? The halls all picked out? His mouth opened. Nothing came. Because here's what I can't understand, Margaret said. And now, finally, something moved under the clear surface of her voice, something that had been pressed quiet under a table and had been growing in the dark ever since. I can understand wanting the money. I raised you too much and too little at the same time, maybe. And money makes people stupid and cruel. I've seen it my whole life. I can almost understand that. But the room, Brian, her voice did not break. It was worse than breaking. You and Stephanie and your brother stood in your father's study while he was dying upstairs, and you picked out the room you were going to put me in. You decided I was a sad old woman nobody would listen to. You said, Stephanie, you said, who's she going to complain to? Stephanie's face went white, then a mottled, ugly red. I never. You did, dear, word for word. Margaret let the silence do its work. Would you like to know how I know? Nobody answered. The clock ticked. Outside, the indifferent autumn morning went on. I'll let you think about that, Margaret said. She stood slowly, because her knees were her knees, but she stood, and not one of them rose to help her, and this time she didn't need them to. Now, I'd like all three of you out of my house. Take your doctor. Take your folder. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do, and that, the not knowing, the wondering what an old woman who turned out to be paying attention might do next. That's the first honest thing I've given the three of you in a month. They went. Bluster from Brian on the way out, low and ugly. You're confused, Mom. You're not thinking straight. This is exactly what we've been worried about. And Margaret simply held the door and said nothing, because she understood now that the words were no longer for her. They were for the record he didn't know was being kept. Dr. Pierce went fast, not meeting her eyes, his black bag clutched to his chest. Stephanie went last, and at the door she turned, and for 1 second the bright, cool mask was entirely gone, and something raw and frightened looked out from under it. Not malice, Margaret thought. Something worse and more human than malice. Something cornered. And then it was gone, and the door was closed, and 2 cars were backing too fast out of her drive. Margaret stood alone in the sudden quiet of her own living room, in the room where she'd watched 40 years of television beside a man who was gone, and she became aware that her heart was slamming and her hands were finally, now that it was over, shaking hard. She crossed to the bookshelf. She put one hand flat on the cracked leather of Walter's old satchel, the way you'd put a hand on a shoulder. "I didn't go quiet," she told him silently. "You should have seen me. I didn't go quiet." Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out the small recorder and looked down at the little red light, steady and patient and entirely unnoticed, recording every word, the doctor's syrupy battery, the question about the money. Who's she going to complain to? All of it, every voice, clean and clear and admissible in any courtroom in Ohio. And Margaret Ellsworth, 68 years old, did something she had not done since the gray Tuesday in October. She smiled. "Good," she said aloud, to the empty room, to the satchel, to Walter, to herself. She pressed stop. "Now I have your voices too. Now I have your voices too," she'd said to an empty room. And then she had sat down, quite suddenly, on the edge of Walter's chair, and let her hands shake until they were done shaking, because being strong in front of them had cost more than she'd let any of them see. Then she'd called Edward Cole, and the war began in earnest. It did not look like a war. That was the thing Margaret learned the next 2 weeks. That real power, the God Walter had spent 18 months building for her, made almost no noise at all. There were no confrontations. There was paperwork. There were quiet meetings in Edward's low brick office, and phone calls returned within the hour, and a forensic accountant named Ruth who spread 3 years of Brian's phantom invoices across a conference table and walked Margaret through them line by line until Margaret understood the theft better than the thief did. Edward moved with the patience of a man who had been getting ready for this for a year and a half. He filed nothing dramatic. He simply prepared, assembling, ordering, authenticating. He took the recording from Friday morning and had it transcribed and certified. He took Walter's recordings, the night on the stairs, and 3 others, and did the same. He pulled the bank records. He documented the money trail from Stephanie's hand to Dr. Pierce's account. A payment, it turned out, of $6,000 wired 4 days before the visit, with a memo line so stupid it was almost sad consult. And quietly, without fanfare, Edward filed one short letter with the state grievance committee, noting that the attorney who had read Walter Ellsworth's will to his widow and then slid her an empty bag across the table was the same attorney whose name appeared as counsel of record on a draft petition to have that same widow declared incompetent. "That," Edward said mildly, "will end Diane Mercer, whether we ever set foot in a courtroom or not. You can't sit on both sides of a person like that. The committee won't even need our help." Margaret moved a portion of the trust into a working account, not secretly, openly now, because there was no longer any reason to hide the armor. She retained her own counsel beyond Edward, a litigator named Foster who specialized, it turned out, in exactly this: the quiet epidemic of families who tried to seize elderly relatives through the guardianship courts. "More common than you'd ever believe," Foster told her, the first day. "You're not unusual, Mrs. Ellsworth. That's the part that ought to make you angry. You're just one of the ones who found out in time." The petition came on a Tuesday. They filed it after all. Margaret had half expected them to run, but Brian was too deep with the people he owed, and Mark was too sick to think, and Stephanie, Foster said, had clearly decided that the only way out of the corner was straight through. They filed for emergency guardianship and conservatorship with Diane Mercer's name on it even now, and a hearing was set, fast, the way these things were designed to move fast, before the alleged incapacitated person could organize a defense. They did not know she had organized her defense 2 weeks before they filed it. The hearing was held in a small courtroom on the 3rd floor of the county courthouse. On a cold, bright morning in November, Margaret wore the navy dress again, the good one, Walter's favorite, the one she'd worn to the reading of the will. It felt right to close the circle in it. Brian and Stephanie were already there when she came in, seated at a table with Diane Mercer, and Margaret watched the 3 of them turn to look at her and watched the confidence on their faces. Because in their minds, this was already over. In their minds, an old woman was about to be quietly, legally, permanently set aside. Brian gave her a look of such practiced, sorrowful concern that she nearly admired it. He should have been an actor, she thought. We both should have. Mark was not at the table. Mark sat alone in the gallery, in the back row, gray-faced and shaking faintly, and he would not look at anyone. And Margaret felt something twist in her chest at the sight of him that had nothing to do with the courtroom, because that was not a conspirator. That was a sick boy who had been brought along to a thing he didn't have the strength to stop. Then Edward Cole and Foster came in behind her and set their briefcases on the respondent's table. And Margaret Mercer's exact moment, the confidence left the other table, saw Diane Mercer's head turn, saw her recognize Edward, saw something in the older lawyer's lined, unhurried face that made Mercer go very still. It did not take long. That was almost the cruelest part for them. How quickly the thing they'd built came down. Foster rose and informed the court, with great courtesy, that before the petition proceeded, the respondent wished to establish a few facts material to her alleged incapacity. He entered the trust documents. The court would note that the alleged incapacitated person was sole trustee and beneficiary of an irrevocable trust holding assets in excess of $45 million, that she owned outright the real property beneath all 4 retail centers and the Route 9 distribution yard, that she held the controlling voting interest in the parent company, that she was, in plain terms, the landlord and the majority owner of the very business the petitioners had inherited and now operated at her sufferance. He suggested dryly that a woman managing such an estate did not seem to be the helpless figure the petition described. He entered the certified recording of October 27th and played 90 seconds of it in open court. Dr. Pierce's syrupy battery, the question about the money, and then, clear as a bell in the silent room, Stephanie's voice from the doorway saying the things she had said. Margaret watched the judge's face as it played. She watched it set. He entered Ruth's forensic accounting, $1.5 million routed out of the company through suppliers that did not exist, over 3 years by the petitioner Brian Ellsworth. He entered the wire to Dr. Pierce 4 days before the routine visit, memo line, consult. And last, almost gently, he noted for the record the matter already pending before the State Grievance Committee concerning the petitioner's counsel. And Diane Mercer, who had not said 3 words, began quietly packing her briefcase, because there is a point at which a lawyer understands she is no longer defending a client but standing next to a fire. It was over in under an hour. The petition was dismissed. The judge, an older man with a face like weathered stone, looked down at the petitioner's table for a long moment over his glasses. He said he had sat on the probate bench for 22 years, and that he saw this more often than the public would ever credit. Families coming into his courtroom to wrap the theft of a parent in the language of love and concern. He said it was, in his considered judgment, among the lowest things human beings did to one another. He said the conduct documented before him would be referred to the district attorney's office for review. And then he looked, not at Brian, not at Stephanie, but at Margaret, in her navy dress, sitting straight-backed at the respondent's table, and he said, "Mrs. Ellsworth, the court finds you entirely competent to manage your own affairs, and frankly better equipped to do it than most. I'm sorry you had to spend a morning proving it. You're free to go." She did not go straight home. She went, instead, to her own house on Sycamore Lane, and she told Edward and Foster she wanted to do the next part herself, alone, and over their objections she did, because the courtroom had been the law. What came next was the family, and the family was hers to finish. She called them that evening, both her sons. She did not call to plead. She called to set the terms. They came the next morning, not with lawyers, not with doctors, not with folders. They came the way Walter had said they would never come until it was too late, with nothing in their hands and everything on their faces. Brian, who looked older than he had a month ago, the cold mask cracked clean off, and under it, just a frightened man who owed money he couldn't pay to people who didn't forgive. And Mark, thin and trembling and unable to meet her eyes, sick in a way she could, finally, after Walter's letter, see plainly for what it was. She let them in. She did not offer coffee. She sat in Walter's chair. Hers now, she had decided. She had moved the satchel to the table beside it, and she let them stand in the middle of the living room, and she let the silence stretch until Brian broke. Mom, you'll listen, Margaret said, not unkindly, but not as a request. Both of you. You've done all your talking. Now you'll listen, and then you'll decide, and what you decide will be the rest of your lives. I mean that exactly. She turned to her older son first. Brian, you stole $1.5 million from the company your father built. The accounting is finished. The number isn't in question. The district attorney has it now, and so do I. She watched him flinch. Here is what's going to happen, and the only reason it's a choice at all and not a prison cell is that I am choosing to make it one, and I can stop choosing that at any moment. You will repay every dollar. It will come out of your half. The wholesale division your father left you, because you hold it, but I own the ground under it, and I hold the votes, and I can make your half worth a great deal or nothing at all. You know that now. You'll repay it on a schedule Ruth sets, not you. And you will work it off, Brian. Actually work, under supervision, starting in the nursery yard's vines at the morning shift, hauling soil and sorting trucks alongside the men whose wages you've been quietly cutting to cover what you skimmed. You'll learn the business your father built the way he built it. From the ground before dawn, with your hands. Mom, I can't. Those people I owe, they won't wait for a schedule. I know who you owe. Her voice did not change. I've already had Foster make contact. They'll be paid by me in full this week because I will not have my son in the river over a gambling debt no matter what he's done. But she let the word land. Every dollar I pay them comes off your inheritance, recorded, owed back to the trust on the same schedule as the rest. I am not rescuing you, Brian. I am buying your safety, and you will repay me for it like the loan it is. And somewhere in the years it takes you, you may finally learn what a dollar costs when you earn it instead of stealing it. Your father started with a crate of tomato seedlings and nothing else. You're going to find out what that felt like. Brian's jaw worked. For a moment, the old defiance flickered, and then she watched it go out, watched him understand fully that the woman in the chair held every card and had chosen, for reasons he did not deserve, to leave him a hand to play at all. He sat down heavily on the edge of the sofa and put his face in his hands and said nothing, which was the first wise thing he'd done in years. Then she turned to Mark and her voice changed entirely. Mark, look at me. He did finally, with red, wet eyes, and she felt her own composure waver and held it. You're not in trouble, sweetheart. You're sick. Your father knew it before I did, and he wrote it down so I'd understand it wasn't wickedness, it was an illness, and I do understand. But understanding it doesn't mean letting it kill you, and it's killing you. And I won't watch it. She drew a breath. So here is what I'm asking not ordering, because this one you have to want or it won't hold. You'll go into treatment. Real treatment, not a weekend, not a clinic where rich people pretend, a real program, 90 days. I'll pay for it and I'll drive you there myself tomorrow morning. The forged checks, he flinched, are between us and they stay between us, repaid quietly out of your inheritance, no police, no record. Because a record helps no one, and forgiveness for you is going to start with making it possible for you to come back. You testify to nothing. You confess to nothing public. You just get well. That's the whole sentence. Get well and come home and be my son again. Will you do that? Mark made a sound she had not heard from him since he was a small boy, and crossed the room and knelt down by Walter's chair, by her chair, and put his head against her knee, and Margaret put her hand in his thinning hair and held her sick child while he wept, and over his shaking shoulders she looked at Brian, and for the first time something passed between mother and older son that was not power and was not punishment. Just two people sharing the same grief at the same wreck. There was one person not in the room. Where's Stephanie? Margaret asked when Mark was quiet. Brian's face closed. Gone. She left. Took what was in the joint account and went to her sister's the day after the hearing. Won't return my calls. A short, awful laugh. Turns out when there's no money coming, there's no Stephanie. Margaret nodded slowly. She had expected it. She reached to the table beside her, beneath the satchel, and took out one last folder, Foster's work, and set it on the coffee table without opening it. I'm not going to show you what's in here, Brian, she said quietly. You've had enough taken out from under you this month, but you should know it exists, and you should know what it holds, and then you should let her go and not chase her, for your own sake. She was siphoning from your accounts for 2 years, 50,000 and more, separate from anything you did. And she wasn't faithful. There's a man, a trainer at her gym. It's been going on the better part of a year. She wasn't waiting to inherit with you, Brian. She was waiting to inherit and leave you. She watched the last thing in her son break gently and was sorry for it. I'm not telling you to wound you. I'm telling you so. You don't spend the next year of your life crawling after someone who is always going to be standing at the door the day the money ran out. Let her go. And then, because Walter's letter had asked her to choose with her eyes open, and her eyes were open now, Margaret said one more thing, the thing that surprised even her. And don't hate her too much. I saw her face when she left here that Friday. She grew up with nothing, that girl. Real nothing, the kind that doesn't let go of you. And she was so afraid of falling back into it that she'd have climbed over anyone to stay out, including me, including you. That doesn't make it right. Nothing makes it right. But it makes it human, and I find lately that I'd rather understand people than only hate them. It costs less in the long run. She closed the folder. She's not worth your hatred. None of this is. Save your strength. You're both going to need it. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Then Margaret Ellsworth stood up out of her husband's chair, her chair, and crossed to the window, and looked out at the November light going gold on the bare trees. And behind her, one son sat with his face in his hands, and the other knelt, sick and weeping on the floor. And she felt something she had not expected to feel at the end of all this, something that was not triumph and was not even relief. It felt like the very beginning of a garden in the worst of the cold, when nothing shows above the ground and you have only the dead man's word that anything was ever planted there at all. Go home, she said gently, not turning around. Both of you. Brian, the morning shift starts at 5:30. Mark, I'll be at your door at 8, and you'll be packed. We start tomorrow. A pause. We start tomorrow. She heard them rise. She heard them go. She heard the front door close quietly this time, no cars backing too fast out of the drive. And then the house was hers, entirely hers, in the golden silence of the falling afternoon. Margaret stood at the window a while longer. Then she went and laid her hand once more on the cracked old leather of Walter's satchel. It's done, she told him. The hard part's done. She thought about that and corrected herself because she had stopped somewhere in the last month being a woman who told herself comfortable things. No, it started. The hard part starts tomorrow at 5:30 in the cold. The easy part was the courtroom. A small, tired, real smile. You knew that, didn't you? You knew the law was never going to be the hard part. Outside, the light went gold, then amber, then began slowly to go. And Margaret Ellsworth turned on a lamp against the coming dark and sat down in her husband's chair and began, for the first time since a gray Tuesday in October, to think not about what had been taken from her, but about what, with $45 million and the rest of her life and 2 broken sons and a dead man's faith in her, she was now going to build. She had turned on a lamp against the coming dark and sat down to think about what she would build. And the building, it turned out, began at 5:30 the next morning, in the cold, exactly as she'd promised, though not for her. For Brian. Margaret was there to see it, though she stood back where he couldn't, in the gray before dawn at the Route 9 yard with a paper cup of coffee going cold in her hands. She watched her older son arrive in work boots that were too new. She watched Earl, the yard foreman, 61 years old, who had loaded trucks for Walter Ellsworth for 29 years and had no reason on earth to be kind about it, hand Brian a pair of gloves and a pallet jack and a look that said everything. And she watched Brian, who 6 weeks ago had sat in his dead father's chair, checking his phone, while a doctor wrote down that his mother was incompetent, bend down in the freezing dark and begin to load bags of soil onto a truck, one at a time, for men whose wages he'd been skimming. He didn't see her. That was important. She didn't come to be seen. She came because she needed to know whether it would take, whether there was anything left in him that honest work could reach. And she stayed until the sun came up over the stacks of mulch and fieldstone, and she watched him work, clumsy and slow and sweating, in the cold. At one point, he stopped and put his hands on his knees and just breathed, and Earl said something to him she couldn't hear, and Brian nodded and straightened up and went back to it. It was a small thing. But Margaret had spent 46 years learning to read a man by the set of his shoulders, and something in the set of her son's shoulders that morning told her he might, just might, make it. She drove Mark to treatment at 8, as promised. He was packed and waiting on his step, gray and shaking, and he wept in the car most of the 2 hours, and she let him and didn't fill the silence. When they reached the place, a real place, plain and unglamorous, 90 days, no pretending, she walked him to the door and held both his and said, I will be here every visiting day they allow, and I am not going anywhere, and neither are you. Do you hear me? And he said he heard her, and she watched the door close on her youngest child and sat in the parking lot for a while before she could trust herself to drive. That was the start. And here is the thing nobody tells you about starts. They don't hold the first time. Walter's letter had warned her, in its way, forgiveness is a process, not an event, but she'd had to learn it the hard way, like everything. Mark relapsed in his 6th week. She got the call at 2 in the morning. He'd walked out of the program, scored, and been found by a counselor in a gas station 2 miles away, alive barely. Margaret drove through the dark to a hospital she'd never been to, and sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent light, and held her son's cold hand while a monitor beeped. And somewhere in the long gray hours before dawn, she came as close to despair as she had come through the whole terrible season, closer even than the will, than the courtroom, because the will had only taken her dignity, and this might take her child. But he lived. And when he was awake and ashamed and could not look at her, Margaret did not give him the speech she'd half prepared. She just said, all right, we try again. That's all relapse is, sweetheart. It's the part we find out we have to try again. So we will. And they did. He went back. He started the 90 days over from day one. And this time, slowly, with no guarantees, the way real things happen, it began to hold. While her sons were learning to be men, Margaret was learning to be a force. She dreaded the first day she walked into the company as its owner. She who had never in 46 years signed a single document, who had learned the whole business at a kitchen table and never once been asked to lead it. She'd assembled the staff of the flagship retail center in the big glass greenhouse, all of them watching her with open uncertainty, the boss's widow in a gray suit. A long pause had stretched out before anyone spoke, and then Donna, the store manager, had asked the only honest question in the room. Mrs. Ellsworth, with respect, do you actually know how to run this? And Margaret had looked at the rows of doubtful faces under the fogged glass, and she had told them the truth. No, she said, not the way Walter did. He could read a balance sheet the way you read a face. She let that sit. But I sat across from that man at our kitchen table every single night for 46 years while he talked through every decision he ever made, every supplier, every season, every payroll he couldn't quite cover, every gamble that worked, and every one that didn't. I didn't sign the papers, but I was in the room for all of it. So no, I've never run this. But there is nobody alive who knows it the way I do, because I knew it from the inside of the marriage that built it. And I learned fast, and I am not going anywhere. She paused. And the first thing I'm going to do is raise the floor wage in this company by 30%, effective this Friday. Because I have just spent a month learning exactly how much was being taken out the top, and it's going to start going back where it belongs, to the people under the glass. The silence held one beat, and then Earl of all people, Earl who had come over from the yard, Earl who trusted no one, began slowly to clap, and the greenhouse filled with the sound of it. The audit she ordered went deep, and the workers, once they understood she meant it, came forward with things that turned her stomach. How Brian had cut corners on materials and pocketed the difference. How Mark, in his sickness, had let suppliers slide and let the books rot. How good people had stayed silent for years out of fear for jobs they couldn't afford to lose. Margaret cleaned it out, all of it, with a patience and a thoroughness that surprised everyone but her. She had run a household on a shoestring through the lean years. She knew exactly where money hides, and exactly how a thing is kept honest. Within a year, Ellsworth Gardens was healthier than it had been when Walter died. Not bigger, but cleaner. And the people who worked there had stopped flinching. And then there was the other thing. The thing that started, really, with one sentence in a courtroom. I see this more often than the public would ever credit. And a litigator named Foster saying, "You're just one of the ones who found out in time." Margaret could not stop hearing those words. One of the ones who found out in time, which meant there were others, many others, who didn't. Women her age, mostly. Widows, mostly. Soft with grief and easy to push, with families who came at them like loved ones and meant to take everything, who ended up in quiet rooms with no money of their own and no signature that counted, and no one who would listen, because nobody listens to those. She had $45 million and the rest of her life. She knew suddenly and completely what it was for. She called it the Second Spring Foundation. It began small, a fund, an office, Foster, and two other lawyers taking guardianship cases for elders who couldn't pay, fighting exactly the petition that had nearly buried Margaret on behalf of people with no Walter to have armored them in advance. It grew faster than she could have dreamed because the need, it turned out, was vast and silent and everywhere. Within the first year, they'd helped more than 100. A woman named Helen, whose son had emptied her accounts and left her in a stripped apartment, restored to her own home and her own money. A man named Harold, 81, whose daughter had tried the exact same capacity evaluation trick, stopped cold at the courthouse door by Foster and a certified recording. A woman named Joan, who at 73 got her dignity and her late husband's pension back, and then asked, shyly, whether the foundation needed anyone to answer phones, because she wanted to be the voice on the other end for the next frightened woman who called, and Margaret hired her on the spot. That became the heart of it, in the end. Not the lawyers, though the lawyers mattered. It was the women who'd been saved coming back to do the saving. Decades of life, of raising families and surviving murders and outlasting grief, all of it suddenly useful, suddenly a resource instead of a burden suddenly seen. Margaret built a mentorship around it, the rescued women guiding the newly frightened ones, and she watched people who had been told their value ended with their usefulness discover that it had only just begun. A year and a half after the Gray Tuesday in October, the second spring since Walter died, Margaret stood in the doorway of the flagship greenhouse at dawn. It was spring now, real spring, the first warm one she'd let herself feel since the funeral. The glass was beaded with morning damp, and the long tables ran riot with seedlings in their little black trays, 10,000 small green things reaching up toward the light. She came here often now, early, before anyone. She'd find Brian already at work in the yard most mornings. A foreman himself now, lean and quiet and respected, who'd reap near half of what he'd taken and stopped flinching when his mother's name came up. He'd divorced Stephanie, who had vanished as completely as she'd appeared. He didn't chase her in the end, and he never spoke her name with hatred. And Margaret took quiet pride in that, because she'd taught him that much, at least. And Mark was more than a year clean now, working at the Second Spring Foundation, sitting with other people in the worst hours of their lives, because he knew the inside of those hours and could say, "I've been exactly where you are," and mean it. The first paycheck he'd earned there he'd brought to her, not to give her, just to show her. And his hands hadn't shaken at all, and he'd said, "This is the first money I ever made that I'm proud of." And Margaret had had to turn away to the window so he wouldn't see her face. She stood in the greenhouse in the wet green light and thought about the woman who had walked out of a lawyer's office a year and a half ago with a dead man's empty bag and a broken brass key, certain her life was over. She had been so wrong. That was the thing she wished she could go back and tell that woman, the one crying on the October sidewalk. "You think this is the end. It's the strangest, hardest beginning you'll ever have." She was 69 years old now. She ran 4 thriving businesses and a foundation that had given more than 200 people back their dignity. She was not Walter's widow, and she was not the boy's mother. Not first, not anymore. She was Margaret Ellsworth, and she had finally, in the last decade of her life, walked out of the shadow and into the sun, and the view from here was better than she had ever let herself imagine it could be. She picked up a tray of seedlings and looked at the small green things straining upward. And she thought of the porch at Birch Point, 24 years old, one day, Maggie one day, and she understood at last what Walter had left her. Not the money. The money was just the soil. What he'd left her was the permission to become this late, the person she'd always had inside her and never once been allowed to be. You knew, she said quietly, to the man who wasn't there, to the warm green morning. You knew I had it in me the whole time. You just couldn't tell me to my face. She set the tray down gently among the others. It's all right. You found another way. You always did. Outside, the sun came up over the greenhouses, and the glass caught it and held it, and 10,000 small green things turned all together toward the light. That's where Margaret's letter ends. That's where Margaret's letter ends. Just there, in the greenhouse, in the light. I sat with this one a long time before I read it to you, and I think I know now why it wouldn't let me go. It isn't the money. It's never the money. It's that line her daughter-in-law said in the dark, nobody listens to those. Nobody listens to old women, to widows, to the ones the world has quietly decided are finished. I want you to hear me wherever you are tonight. That is a lie. It was a lie about Margaret, and it is a lie about you. The second spring is real, and it does not check your age at the door. If you've been made to feel invisible by family, by time, by anyone, I'm listening. Write to me. Tell me your story. I'll be here. Good night.